framework regarding these issues is suitable to support the CHIPS Act's goals. Now, access to funds and access to incentives should be open to all companies that play by the rules, regardless of where their physical headquarters is located. It's also equally important that incentives target all stages of the semiconductor supply chain, from research to manufacturing, testing and prototyping, as well as advanced digital skills. And they should cover all technology nodes, from the smallest chips to the larger nodes, which have large application in a variety of uses. Finally, given the global nature of the supply chain, any policy action aimed at strengthening the resilience of the European supply chain should be coupled with ambitious and detailed plans for cooperation with global partners. The EU should work with like-minded partners and allies, such as the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and others, to minimize damaging interruptions and ensure stability of the global semiconductor supply chain. In this context, the very recently established EU-US Technology and Trade Council, often referred to as the TTC, can be the optimal forum for engaging and finding common solutions to improve resilience. This can be done by implementing coordinated and targeted export control policies and adopting common licensing approaches. Also, by pursuing joint research and development initiatives for critical technologies and components where supply chain shortages, gaps, or cost disadvantages with other regions are identified. We're going to talk about all these issues today with experts from across industry and government. And before I introduce our incredible speakers today, let me share a few housekeeping notes with you. Now, we will save time during our time together today for questions from all of you, our incredible audience. So please be thinking about those questions, and the best way to get those questions to us so I can get them to our speakers is through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So think of your question, enter it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click send, and that will get it over to our team. Also, a reminder, we are streaming today's session live on YouTube, and a recording will be available on our YouTube channel after this event is concluded. And please engage with us and the discussion and share your thoughts on Twitter at ITI_tech tweets. That's our Twitter handle. And now it is my enormous pleasure to introduce to all of you our speakers today. Let me first introduce Lucilla Scioli, who is the Director for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Industry within the DG Connect at the European Commission. Lucilla is responsible for the coordination of the European digitization of industry strategy and for policy development in the areas of artificial intelligence and semiconductors. The directorate in which she works is also responsible for supporting research and development initiatives in key digital industrial technologies, including microelectronics, photonics, robotics, and AI. Lucilla, welcome. Let me next introduce a member of the European Parliament who's known for her focus on technology issues. Eva Meidel is a member of the European Parliament in the EPP group. MEP Meidel's policy priorities include innovation and the use of new technologies, as well as supporting entrepreneurs and sustainable investments in Europe. In the European Parliament, she is a member of the Industry and Economic Affairs Committees, as well as the EPP Group Coordinator for the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence. Now, MEP Meidel may need to leave a little bit early, so we'll make sure to focus questions to her early on. She has a constituent event, which is obviously important for her to participate in, but I want to make sure to thank her for being here today. Let me next introduce Christian Eisenschmidt, who is the Vice President of Worldwide Government Affairs for Intel. Intel is an ITI member company, one of the biggest global players in the semiconductor industry, one of the biggest employers in the semiconductor sector across Europe, and one of the biggest participants in the important public policy discussions around semiconductors and EU supply chain. And finally, let me introduce Wouter Baljon, who is with us today from ASML. You're hopefully all familiar with ASML, a global leader in advanced manufacturing equipment for the semiconductor industry and one of the leading suppliers to the semiconductor industry. Wouter is the EU Government Affairs Lead for ASML, and it's great to have him with us today. Let me start our discussion by asking the panelists a question about the European Chips Act. And I'll direct the question to all four of our speakers. Lucilla, I'll ask you to go first with your thoughts on this. We all know from being tech policy participants that the broader goal underpinning the European Chips Act is to double Europe's share of global revenues for semiconductors. Currently, that share is under 10% of the worldwide market. The goal of the European Chips Act is to double that to 20% by 2030. And this is a very important goal. ITI and our member companies strongly support it because strengthening semiconductor supply chain in the EU, from research to manufacturing and everything in between, will obviously greatly strengthen the resilience of the supply chain while increasing Europe's global competitiveness. So I want to ask our speakers, how can the European Chips Act succeed in meeting this very ambitious goal? And is the pursuit of this goal sufficient enough to achieve the kind of resilient supply chains, in your opinion? Lucilla, obviously your focus at DG Connect is on all of these important technology issues and EU competitiveness. Let me start with you. What should we look to as part of the European Chips Act, and what are you hoping it will accomplish?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody following this event, and good morning, of course, if you're in the United States. Well, the CHIPS Act is really a unique opportunity for the European Union to be able to strengthen its capabilities in the field of semiconductors. And it will help to achieve our ambitious targets because, on the one hand, it will help in attracting investment because it will make Europe a more attractive place to invest, both because we have tried to a little bit, adapt and give guidance on our rules for investment in the European Union, but also because we have created some incentives, for example, in the form of financial instruments that we make available also for the small, medium enterprises to grow. And in fact, our ambition is to be strengthening our design and manufacturing capabilities, but also strengthening our ecosystem in general. And so there also startups and SMEs, of course, play a very important role. And to do this, we are also going to start a new program that we call the Chips for Europe initiative, which is a program in support of innovation. Basically, we have realized that until now, we have had excellent research in the European Union, but now we need to become better at bringing this output of research closer to the industrial capabilities, and so as to strengthen the industrial capabilities in the European Union. And so we have a dedicated program that in the, let's say, mid to long term should exactly help us to bring excellent research outputs to our industries. And then last but not least, we are going to work very closely with the member states in the European Union to monitor the value chain. You know that the value chain is global, it's very complex, and recently the world has experienced shortages that was very difficult for all of us to understand what they were due to, where they were coming from, and we want to become better at being able to anticipate these shortages and be able to react to them. And so we have to put in place a toolbox of measures that we can actually activate once supply chain disruptions are so significant that they are having a negative impact on the European economy. So this is in essence what the CHIPS Act does, and through these three measures in terms of strengthening our environment for investment, creating a new program for innovation and for going faster from the lab to the fab, and working with member states to increase transparency of the value chain and be able to react to shortages and other disruptions, then we think that we are well equipped to achieve our targets of 2030.
Well, thank you very much, and certainly appreciate all the work that you and your DG Connect colleagues are doing to advance the digital industry through these kind of measures that will encourage investment in semiconductors. And of course, the company that we most associate with those kind of investments is Intel. And I want to turn to Kristen next to ask about Intel's perspective on this, because Intel is obviously a global manufacturer and supplier. So Kristen, I wanted to ask for your perspective on why the European Chips Act is so important and the achievability of these goals to double Europe's share of the semiconductor market. And I also wanted to ask you to comment on what our cooperation with international partners should look like to achieve this objective, because of course Intel is very focused on increasing manufacturing capability around the world. So Kristen, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, and good afternoon from my side and good morning to the US-based audience. So as Intel, we definitely welcome the EU Chips Act. We appreciate that it's the first time we take a very comprehensive and holistic view on the semiconductor supply chain. And we really think it's important that it involves all segments of the supply chain, from research to development. Design capability is an important element, but also manufacturing and packaging and test. So in order to make the supply chain more resilient, we have to look at all elements and understand where the gaps are exactly. We understand that each region would like to be fully autonomous or independent, but from today's perspective, we think this is just not possible, because the semiconductor industry is really and truly international. The technology is so sophisticated and so complex and requires such huge, massive investments that we need to understand who the key players are, who are best suited in order to help to make the EU supply chain more resilient. So as Intel, we are fully committed to invest in Europe and to contribute to make the supply chain more resilient. We have proven that we would like to be an essential partner to Europe, because we are in the region for 30 years, even more than 30 years, with our manufacturing site in Ireland and also with our other locations in Europe. And we think that continuing this partnership, this transatlantic partnership, is really important. We can contribute to make the supply chains more resilient with our investments, and we are really glad that there's now such a strong focus on manufacturing, because we think manufacturing is at the center and it really catalyzes innovation and investments in all other areas, because researchers need access to pilot lines, to leading edge manufacturing capabilities in order to drive innovation for our customers and with our customers. We appreciate also that a longer term perspective is taken, because if you look at today's demand, it's probably more on higher nodes above 10 nanometers. And we know that implementing advanced manufacturing capabilities below 10 nanometers really requires a horizon for 4 or 5 years. So establishing manufacturing capacities, really, if we start greenfield, takes 3 to 4, almost 5 years until the first product reaches the customer. So we appreciate that a longer term vision to that is taken, and that it's also promoted to look at advanced capabilities where the demand will only develop over time. So we see it's continuing to grow, and overall, by the end of the decade, I think there will be a strong demand for advanced semiconductor products. But we need to make sure that the investments happen now and happen fast if we want to have the supply ready when the demand is picking up.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for that very valuable industry perspective. And now the parliamentary perspective. I want to next turn to MEP Meidel, again with our gratitude to her for being here on a very busy and challenging time. Wanted to ask for your perspective, for the parliamentary perspective on this. You've been such a leader across new technology innovation, including as the rapporteur on the first ever effort to build an artificial intelligence law. So I know these technology policy issues are near and dear to your heart. So I wanted to ask you for your perspective on the European Chips Act and how you feel about prospects for enactment of that important measure, and how you think it is important for all of Europe to see this renewed investment in semiconductor capabilities.
Thank you very much, Jason, and I would like to thank ITI for inviting me today. I think we have set ourselves an ambitious goal, but I think ambition and innovation are both needed in order for us to fuel the digital transformation. I'm very praiseful of the CHIPS Act and the ability to show that we could act fast. Yes, sometimes our foresight is not always very timely, but still, I think in the past couple of weeks, particularly, we have shown that we could move mountains with political will, and Europe can be united and powerful when it's needed. So particularly going to the CHIPS Act, increased investment by the European institutions, I think it's very welcome. It's also needed. But in the same time, I think we need to be aware that public money cannot solve also the global market problem that we are facing. So what we are trying, I think, to do is to make sure we create an environment that encourages private investment and it does not necessarily replace it. And this is why I think the Act in a way can play an important part of achieving this supply chain resilience. But in the same time, we cannot put all our eggs in the same basket. So increasing our manufacturing capabilities must not come at the price of investment in chip design, for example. I think we need to have with this Act immediate result, but we also need to build this long-term resilience and foresight into our industrial policy as a general rule, so to say, because today is chips and tomorrow will be something else. You mentioned AI, for example. So we need to find ways to be better prepared to secure our digital sovereignty. These buzzwords such as strategic autonomy, is not, I hope, meant to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world, but to make sure that our economic future is in our own hands while we are together with our like-minded partners in this whole endeavor. We are very much, I think, aware that we cannot match the huge amounts of state aid that it's pumped into China and the US, or the production we see in Taiwan. But that doesn't mean we are not part of the game. It means we need to be a little bit more strategic. And the CHIPS Act is not necessarily a silver bullet by itself, and in a way it's also not intended to be, and I personally don't look at it in this way. I think it has to be part of a broader, of a wider and more holistic strategy, one that perhaps rests on a number of points. And the first one I hinted at it. It's work closely with our democratic allies. It's making sure we are building these digital alliances of democracies that create permanent semiconductor forums in the image of TTC. I think, Jason, in the beginning, you mentioned the importance of the Trade and Technology Council. I would like to see that this council is not necessarily built on 5 or 10 working groups, but let's make these working groups of importance. And if semiconductor is one of these areas, let's make it a very operational with high priority working group or a project, or however one wants to call it. That's not so important. It's important that it delivers results in the short term, make something tangible. And what a better way when the US is discussing and debating and already is a step ahead with this CHIPS Act, what a better way to merge our both strategies and to discuss ways of how to move ahead. Then a second point is to make sure that our diplomacy and relationships around the world are really open up to this sort of new supply chains that we need to create. And this goes through my third small point, which is, solidifying relationship that share our norms and our values. Of course, the US, but Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia. I don't like to look at Europe only and say we are going to have the best plan. We have to make sure that we are the ones reaching out to our like-minded partners. And finally, I think building this CHIPS Act, it has to respond also to our specific needs and our needs and assets, and they play a strong role when it comes to the cutting edge research, when it comes to the talent, to the mobility of workers that we are witnessing, but also part of this strong international diplomatic network, because I think we should not only pursue the maximization of production, but we should also maximize on the innovation. But that here, and I think this is where the private sector could chip in, and I would be curious to hear from the next speaker, as we already heard from Christine, what are the demands actually in the next 5 years? I think companies have a good understanding of where the demands lie for the next 5 or 10 years. We want to be producing in one way, yes, the most advanced chips, but I think it's most important to produce the chips that are most desired, whether they're the most advanced or maybe not necessarily for the next 5 years ahead of us or 10 years. So I would leave it out there with this suggestion, because I believe the Commission should also be engaging with the private sector to see where the demands lie. And we as a Parliament will be happy to also understand where those demands are. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And Wouter, you have your assignment from MEP Maidel of what to talk about. But I think also one of the reasons we're most pleased to have you here today is ASML is obviously a great reminder that the semiconductor supply chain ecosystem is more than just the semiconductors themselves. It's about the companies that make the things that make the semiconductors, and that's what ASML is. So over to you to close us out on this question about your optimism about what the European CHIPS Act can accomplish.
Great. The expectations have been raised here. So first of all, thank you to ITI for such an impressive lineup. It's very humbling also listening to some of the previous interventions, and you might have seen me nodding enthusiastically. I've heard many great things from the previous speakers. The downside of going last is that there's obviously the inevitable duplication. But let me also first start by thanking the Commission, who've done an admirable job, and for the very rare occasions they've managed to fast track by 5 months the delivery on a very complex act, which will now go into co-legislation, and it's going to be quite a roller coaster ride, I imagine, also in view of everything that is happening around us, which is in some cases deeply depressing. As ASML, we support any kind of ambition when it comes to semiconductor policy, because it's highly needed. And even if some find it far-fetched, such as the 20% target. If you take Moore's Law, which we like to talk about in semiconductor circles, it has been declared dead on many occasions, but I think our customers, and I have to include Intel here, they keep on proving that it's very much alive and kicking. And we're delighted that, as a European player, we can contribute to it. From our perspective, in order to respond to the semiconductor demand for the future, which I think we're very much talking about here, Europe needs to very much improve its understanding of the innovation hotspots, which you find across the entire value chain, and unfortunately not often in Europe. And without mastering advanced production, which I think we've talked about, or previous speaker have talked about, I think it will be very difficult. So it's something that I think is an essential component, but definitely not the only component. The countries that now can be seen as the so-called, I think, production trendsetters are very much Taiwan and South Korea. And in our view, it's important that key geographies such as the US, Japan, and the EU increase their relevance. I think that, without talking about targets in terms of percentage of global production, I think relevance is very important for us, so that we avoid similar shortages in the future. This proposed CHIPS Act, I think, is more than an admirable attempt to, it acknowledges the need for state-of-the-art R&D, of which the EU has quite a bit. It highlights the need for production innovation, and also, I think, very essential, having better visibility of the strengths and weaknesses of Europe, which I think, Europe currently doesn't really have. And this, coupled with growth of chip end markets in Europe, and I'm now coming to the point of MEP Maidel, I think what we've recently done in an exercise to deliver something of a reflection, we've very much seen that, there's key end markets in Europe, so industrial IoT, telecommunication, and automotive, where there's an interesting mix of both advanced and mature chips that are needed. And I take offense when people say that there's no market in Europe for chips. That might not be the case for PCs or smartphones. But I think if there's one thing we've learned from, let's say, the past 2 years, is that we've heavily underestimated the explosion of IoT. Look where we find ourselves, I think, and no household, particularly after everything we've ordered during COVID, is not rammed with IoT devices, and that, I think, needs to be reflected. However, and I think this point was also made, we do see similar maneuvers in other parts of the world, sort of comparable to what Europe is doing. So it's essential that whatever Europe does is, let's say, strategic, that we don't do things that other parts of the world do better. Just as an example, we shouldn't end up in a situation where we start competing with East Asian countries on something where we will never be able to outcompete them. So that is just something of a thought that I wanted to leave here. I think last but not least, I think it was also referred to by other speakers, dialogue is extremely important. I mean, for us, dialogue with our customers, with our suppliers, but similarly, I think the diplomatic channels that were referred to by MEP Maidel are key. I think it's also safe to say that the countries that have been often mentioned, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, they benefit from having a more robust European ecosystem, because in the end, this is a global supply chain in which Europe plays a role. And I think also TTC is just one of the vehicles that should be used to make sure that we coordinate more successfully.
Great.
So
Thanks very much, Father. Thank you. And I want to move on to a question that builds on something that all four of our speakers have emphasized, and that is the importance of resiliency and security in supply chains. And I want to start with MEP Maidel with this next question. Obviously, all of our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine for the terrible experience of the Russia invasion, and it's been heartening to see the worldwide response. And that response has been in the kind of partnership between and among the EU and the US and other like-minded allies around the world. It has also emphasized the humanitarian response, and the economic sanctions response on Russia has also brought to mind the importance of future collaboration toward the objective of securing supply chains. And one of the ways, obviously, that we've talked about doing that is increasing the capacity in the EU around manufacturing, but also giving new tools to EU policymakers to deal with disruptions that may occur in the near future. So we know that the European Chips Act, for example, has a proposal that allows member states to conduct reviews of supply chains. We know that it allows and empowers the Commission to trigger the kind of crisis stage decision in case of serious disruptions. So I wanted to ask our panelists to think about the consultation and the collaboration that needs to happen moving forward between public authorities and the private sector, including, for example, the European Semiconductor Board, to jointly react to disruptions, to ensure coordination moving forward without disrupting the operations of manufacturers. We also want to make sure that this happens without public authorities necessarily intervening in the market allocation of supply by prioritizing one sector over another. So I want to ask our panelists to share their thoughts, starting with MEP Meidel, about the key steps to take to secure the supply chain from ongoing and potential future crises. Do you think the CHIPS Act takes the right approach to this objective? And how, in your view, can the industry and the public sector best cooperate on these important issues? MEP Meidel, can I ask you to take that first?
Thank you very much. Well, I think I have always been one of those members or elected representative that has always called for more cooperation between the public and the private sector. In some European countries, that's not necessarily seen as a good thing for a number of reasons. But I think especially in areas where the private sector is pioneering and is innovating at a pace where the public sector can barely catch up if necessary or intervene, it's extremely important to find ways to cooperate. I think it's also important to cooperate given and taking into consideration and given the recent developments from the past 2 weeks and for the past 2 years that have tremendously affected the way we live and the way we work and the way we even make decisions. So this is why I think effective supply chain are more than important to be consistent. We cannot basically have the tap constantly turn on and off by a global event. What we are seeing is that in Europe, we might be making some of the best cars in the world, but we are not able to drive them outside of the factory. And so I think the resilience in a system can be a consequences of a number of things. And part of those things and part of the recipe is perhaps to make sure there's more solidarity among democratic players, more understanding of these important economic areas in a way, while in the same time we ensure regulatory flexibility, but also a reliability coming from the regulations. I mentioned foresight before. I mean, it's also about having these forecasting mechanisms and making sure what is there to expect in the next couple of years to come. And I think also we need to have some sort of a diversification of interest, but also investments. I don't need to go down into the number of details about 30 years ago about the amount of chips we were marketing and producing in Europe. We know where we are today, and we know where we want to be in the next 10 years. But basically, when countries like Taiwan were building a resilient and dominant sector, Europe was looking on the other side of the world to supply them. And we kind of felt as a society, and not just when it comes to chips, that the good times will never end. Now, I think just over the past, as I said again, 2 weeks and 2 years, I think we grew older and we grew wiser very quickly. And in order for us to turn around those trends, I think it will be very important I might in a way over repeat myself, but I think this has to be hammered and very well understood among the policymakers. We need to work with our global global allies, and make sure we build our international network of supply chain. But also we have to make sure that we have evolving and, in a way, well-funded digital research programs within Europe. I mentioned talent. I mean, talent is just so key in this whole puzzle. Without talent, without a motivated, without a valued workforce, it will be difficult to build this wider global security by protecting countries like Taiwan and avoiding a total vacuum of European investments in places like Africa, for example. And I think the proposal within the CHIPS Act, there are definitely a number of points, and I'm sure that maybe Lucia will go in more detail, but there are a number of proposals that prevent future crises, whether it's about the coordination mechanism to monitor the semiconductor market, or that we need more close cooperation between the public and sector and the industry. Or some of the other proposals where we could support businesses by creating a safe space for them to innovate, sandboxes in particular. So I think the CHIPS Act is a good starting point to build that framework and to continue encouraging innovation to help the production in Europe. But also we need to understand that this is a geopolitical issue as well. And in a way, it is not a miracle solution. And so that's why I always call that we need to, apart from public and private sectors, democratic allies need to sit on the table and plan together and work together on that topic.
And that makes me want to remind everybody to check out MEP Meidel's article in the European Council on Foreign Relations that just published today, called The Fight for Europe's Digital Future, an excellent read and a reminder of the importance of the West working together on all of the issues that MEP Meidel just talked about to address the digital future of Europe and its allies. So thank you for your thoughts on that. And Wouter, I want to respond to your complaint about being last by making sure you are not last ever again, or at least not last this time. So second is much better for positioning. And it's also a great opportunity for you to talk about these supply chain security and resilience issues. Hopefully everybody knows that ASML, in addition to the vital role that you play in making semiconductor manufacturing possible, the equipment that you make is astoundingly complex, massive in scope, and not the kind of thing that you can just plan to deliver tomorrow. So your perspective on these supply chain security issues, I think, is particularly important given the complexity and the vital role that ASML plays in that supply chain. So over to you.
Thanks. First of all, I wanted to say one thing which I might not have stressed enough in the previous intervention. I think the Commission did a very good job in consulting the industry throughout the process of drafting the CHIPS Act, which must have been extremely challenging given the fact that you cannot physically bring people together to kind of read the room and get the kind of responses. And I hope for the co-legislators, Parliament and Council, that it will be easier for them to get a vibrant and honest discussion going with industry stakeholders. I think going back to sort of the key steps that you've asked me about, I think it's already been mentioned by Kristen, I think we really have to take the long-term perspective. I mean, what we're doing here is we're making policy for effectively the second half of this decade. And particularly in Europe, budgets will not be secured overnight. We've seen it with IPCEI. It's been really difficult to get the kind of financial commitments that are really necessary to make a difference. By which I don't want to sound ungrateful towards the member states that have submitted significant funds, but in order to really make a difference for the sector, which is in Europe has definitely seen underinvestment for easily 2 decades. There is a need to work hard to persuade governments to invest. And I would like to remind all the participants that even though that 40 billion or 43 billion sounds like a lot of money, it is only there to unlock very significant investments from the private sector. I think that's an underestimated element of this whole EU Chips Act discussion, that what it does is effectively incentivizes and it stimulates private parties to invest, to make a more robust European ecosystem. So the buck quite literally doesn't stop at the 43 billion. The aim is to expand it with significant private investments. I would also like to sort of zoom in on a couple of, let's say, components or aspects of let's say, the Chips Act. I mean, what we've already talked about before is I think we really want to maximize the potential of European champions. I mean, we have some in semiconductor design, in manufacturing equipment and materials. Sorry for the self-promotion. And I mean, the global semiconductor ecosystem depends on them. I think that is something that we've definitely seen. I mean, we have in Europe very strong industrial positions in global end markets, and there is a very severe, let's say, economic pain from the current shortage that they're confronted with. I mean, we've seen factories coming to a standstill, which is, you know, not something we had hoped to see. I think I mean, in that sense, it's great to have Intel with us today. We really want to see industry frontrunners, from a production perspective, but also from a design perspective, to really invest more in Europe. We have an immense amount of talent in Europe, but right now their opportunities often find themselves outside of Europe, and they go to greener pastures outside of the EU, whereas we should offer them those greener pastures within the Union. And I think what we've talked about a lot, I mean, we have great R&D facilities in Europe, but even though they are world leading, I think there's still plenty of opportunity to upgrade them, and in line with what Lucilla has said, bring them closer to the fab from the lab. So those are just a couple of takeaways that I wanted to share with you all.
Great, thanks so much, Wouter. And Lucilla, let's turn to you, because DG Connect obviously pays a lot of attention to the digital economy issues facing the EU, including what might happen as a result of the CHIPS Act being enacted. Let me ask you for your perspective on this important question of supply chain security and resiliency and disruptions. What is DG Connect's thoughts on what needs to be done to address those issues?
Well, certainly with the CHIPS Act, we have given a certain impetus to our policies in addressing this issue. And if I can go back also to what was said by Eva and Wouter, I also believe that there is great scope for collaboration between private players and the public sector, in the sense that we are a market economy. So of course we want market players to be leading investments in this area. We are also an open economy, and so we are open to investment that also comes from other parts of the world. And at the same time, I think that the public sector has an important role to play to be able to support that research and innovation that is essential for achieving our objectives, but also to, as I said earlier, collaborate with the member states to make sure that our value chain is resilient. And so to make our value chain resilient is not just a question of maybe making more clear rules that concern investment for large manufacturing facilities in the EU. It is also about supporting efforts, for example, in design, in manufacturing, in packaging. We had, a project of the project of common European interest that the Wouter was mentioning earlier, where more than 20 member states are participating, is extremely important for the resilience of our supply chain in the European Union. And as I also mentioned earlier, it is very important that we are able to make more equity available for our small and medium enterprises that need to grow. This is quite complicated in the European Union. And we really hope now with these efforts that we will make through InvestEU and the European Investment Fund that we can facilitate the efforts of the small medium enterprises that unfortunately often get acquired from non-European players, and this is a problem we have been experiencing in the European Union in these very recent years. But the value chain is not only European. Of course, the value chain is global. So it's important that we also work with our other partners. We call them like-minded partners. They include the United States, of course, and Japan and others, so that we can really have some kind of transparency in the value chain, and we can really anticipate any kind of disruptions or difficulties that is going to take place. So I think that also the collaboration with other partners, I did the discussion in the TTC with the United States, and I think it's a very constructive discussion, and where we actually want to work closely with companies as well, exactly to be able to increase this transparency and be better placed in the future to avoid the crisis that we have been living now. Thank you.
And we look forward to working with you on that as well. I want to get Kristen's thoughts on this as well, but first I want to ask MEP Meidel if we are in danger of losing you to your constituent event in the next couple of minutes. I want to make sure to get back to you because I want to ask you for your predictions about what happens in Parliament. Should we come to you now? Are you close to having to leave, or can we get Kristen's thoughts?
I mean, maybe if we could go to Christian as we're on that subject, and then I already said I'll be a few minutes late. It's just around the corner. That's why I'm in a remote location. But if afterwards I could take the floor, that would be much appreciated.
Absolutely. Appreciate that very much. Kristen, let's talk about this supply chain resiliency issue. Intel obviously brings that global perspective that we've been talking about, having manufacturing capabilities and facilities around the world. What are your thoughts on how the CHIPS Act addresses that important security need?
So now it's my challenge to go last and to risk to be repetitive. I want to keep it short in order to give MEP Meidel the opportunity to not be too much delayed. So what has been said by each of the panelists so far is that dialogue is important. So a dialogue between the public and the private sector, I think it needs to happen in a very structured way and not just randomly. It's important that the industry and the public sector come to a continuous understanding of what the situation is, of how innovation that is happening may change the competitive situation, whether there are new gaps that will come up, or whether gaps that we assume we have so far will close because things change and the industry is so dynamic. So I think it's really key to have an ongoing dialogue and an ongoing exchange. So that's key. Then the idea of an emergency toolbox, I think is really a good idea. And in this case, it's important that the industry and the private sector gets involved at a very early stage, because ultimately, I think there is a risk for us that any regulations or any decisions may hinder us in our ability to compete, or may even be in conflict with existing customer agreements, customer commitments. So I think it's really, really important that we are involved from the beginning to voice concern or to come up with active proposals. The same for chip certifications, potential export controls, priority orders. I think it's important to enter into a constructive dialogue on these. Then talent, that was mentioned several times. I think for us, it's extremely important to make sure that we have a very strong and we keep a very strong talent pipeline. I think the more innovation happens, the more attractive the regions will be for the brightest heads and for the key people in the industry. So that's a joint endeavor or a joint challenge we all have to make sure we keep and we broaden the talent pipeline. And then last but not least, for the industry, it's really important to have reliability. So it was mentioned before that today semiconductor is really in the middle of the focus, this may change and something else come up, but for us as an industry, if we decide to make these huge investments, it's important that we can count on continuous support, and we need to we get assurance that there will be support to make us long-term financially viable. Because if we decide to invest, the investment is so big that it's not just to be there or present in the region for 5 years, because these investments only make sense if we are in the region for decades. So I think the long-term viability and the long-term support needs to be assured.
Right. Thanks so much, Kristen. Okay, MEP Maydell, it's time for you to predict the future, which I know is a terrible thing to ask you to do. You can speak on behalf of yourself. I know you can't speak on behalf of your 704 colleagues who all are required to move this forward. But I did want to ask you, again, with our great thanks for your being here today, I did want to ask you for your thoughts on what happens now. You know, the Commission has proposed this CHIPS Act proposal. Now the ball's in the Court of Legislators to move it forward, bring it across the finish line. What are your thoughts on which the European Parliament will move forward on this kind of timeline? What can we do to help move it forward? And what else are you looking at as part of your work in the Industry Committee as well?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I mean, it's very often what happens in the Parliament is like we don't really act swiftly in the initial process. We take a lot of time deciding who's going to take the file and how it's going to be distributed. Sometimes we spend more time on this than on the actual file. So I hope we've reached the point where that will take little time. Actual proper discussions on some of the points will be more in-depth and productive. And hopefully we will start the work sooner. As I said, our US partners have already started the work. So it will be good if we work in a consistent way. Some of the, and by the way, you said how you can help. I think even events such as today's are very helpful to kind of set the tone of the importance of the topic, which I believe my fellow colleagues also understand, but to kind of see what are the main trends and where we should put the most of energy. But I also think that if some of the discussions were so far surrounded around funding, I hope the Parliament's position will steer away from being over-prescriptive. I think the Act has little time to achieve big things. And I think we need to make sure we are agile in order to adapt to these ever-changing technological advancements, to the global markets, to the political realities we live and that are changing at a faster pace than ever before. And also, I think we have to make sure that we get it right. One would say, well, that's with every legislation. Well, here we can't really have a CHIPS Act #2 by 2025. We need to make sure that we are able to see the big picture, that again, we don't see the issues of today or yesterday, but we are able to see 10 years down the line or 5 years down the line. I know that nobody can predict the future, but you could build certain mechanisms which will make you more prepared and prone to crisis or more resilient. Because you know, we cannot drop this as a priority the moment the next big political hot potato comes around. And many of the people that have joined us here today, the professionals and experts, know that unfortunately when it comes to tech, that's something that happens often. There are a number of topics in the past that had some prominence and then something happens and they're not so prominent anymore. I think we have to build this longevity into our actions. Then I think we also have to make sure we ask ourselves, you know, what is the approach we are taking? Is this act going to be benefiting the whole of Europe? A bit to look into Europe. And what I mean here is talent, and also where this, you know, investments will be situated. It's easy to situate investments, attract investments, and the business know that better than me. But it will be good if there's some sort of strategic thinking also on where these investments should be across Europe. Should they all be situated in the, so to say, known areas of such investments, or perhaps think a little bit more strategic? And lastly, I hope this act will serve to solidify the point that I made, is that we don't become just strong as Europe, but we get closer to our democratic allies, not to isolate ourselves or to say we are the best and the greatest, we have the best solutions. Yes, it's nice. I think we need a boost in that to say we're doing great and we're doing a good job, but we need to strengthen our international links. And I hope this will be possible to be done. There are many points of discussion, and I don't need to maybe now go in detail, but I think, you know, there's the European Semiconductor Board, that I think it needs to be a forum for promoting excellence, promoting unity. There is a lot of points on the funding, as I said, how will member states coordinate with each other, not be in competition with each other. And I think, you know, these are some of the points that will be mainly discussed in the parliament, because we need to work out, you know, also what kind of chips we want to make for the future. What are those ones that will cater the European market, as also previous speakers would say. So there will be a number of points, but I hope we could see and look at this file as area where we could find more unity also within the parliament and less ideology, because I don't really see necessarily a possibility for that ideology in currently here. If we speak about the AI Act, perhaps there we could find more ideological points, but hopefully here we find points that unite us, we act swiftly, and we produce a good position coming from the parliament to fuel those investments across Europe.
That is an excellent point. There is agreement across all of the aisles in the EPP in the European Parliament, certainly in the EPP, but also in the Parliament, about the importance of these investments. And appreciate your highlighting the work that needs to be done to bring it up across the finish line. Certainly, we at ITI look forward to supporting you there, and really appreciate your being with us here today. Just in case you do need to drop off and head to your constituent event, let me say on behalf of ITI, Blagodaria, thank you very much for being with us today. Obviously, the people of Bulgaria are very well represented by you, and we appreciate your leadership on these tech policy issues.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I wish a successful finish of the event, and I would unfortunately have to leave now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. And Kristen, let me come back to you because I think one of the most important things that MEP Majdal mentioned is that the objective of the European Chips Act is to incentivize private investments in Europe of manufacturing capabilities. And we hear a lot about this, this word, incentives. And I wanted to make sure to give you an opportunity to share with our audience what the importance is of those incentives in making manufacturing capability happen. Intel has talked a lot about its global manufacturing footprint and desire to build more manufacturing capability in Europe. And the CHIPS Act obviously is designed to incentivize that kind of construction. So give us an idea, perhaps first and foremost, what goes into building that manufacturing capability? How enormous an undertaking is that? How expensive an undertaking is that? And why is the CHIPS Act so important to incentivize Intel and other semiconductor manufacturers to build that capability in Europe?
Well, Jason, as I said before, investing in manufacturing capacity, it requires massive amounts of money. So just as an example, our recent announcement in the US that we are going to build a greenfield fab included a $20 billion investment for 2 fab modules. So just to give you an idea about the size of the required investments. So currently we see that we have a cost gap when we build fab capacity in the US or in the EU, a cost gap of about 40% compared to Asia. And that cost gap is to a big extent due to the massive support and funding the governments in Asia give or commit to the companies. So that's what we have to compete with. So I think in order to make sure we are financially viable, we can compete in the long term, and we use our shareholders' money wisely, we have to put together a very good argumentation as to why we decide to invest in Europe or in the US. So in that context, I think we need help to cover at least partly the significant cost gap. That's one thing. But also subsidies or help is required in order to make sure we implement the right design capabilities, and that's not necessarily money that needs to go to us or to other manufacturing companies, but that's money that should be provided in order to support the creation of design capabilities, of research capabilities, to really make sure that this innovation happens in close collaboration with researchers and the manufacturing people. So that's one thing. And then what I mentioned before, the long-term viability or reliability. So I think this is really important because we want to make sure that we can manufacture under competitive conditions going forward. So it may be required to think of other ways or policy tools in order to help private investors to remain financially viable in the longer term.
That makes good sense. I appreciate that perspective and that explanation. Lucilla, I wanted to come back to you on this this interesting question of cooperation across like-minded economies, including the EU and the US. We know that the Commission, when it affirmed the idea of cooperation as part of its communication accompanying the CHIPS Act, talked about the importance of policy actions strengthening the resilience of European supply chains, but also doing it in partnership with cooperation with global partners like the US. And as Kristen mentioned, the goal here is to address pretty significant state subsidies that China is providing to make sure that we are encouraging manufacturing to happen in the EU and the US and other partners. Can you talk to us a little bit, Lucilla, about how you envision this cooperation working in practice, for example, between the EU and the US? What you think the right forum for discussion is? There was mention earlier of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council and the importance of coordination between the EU and the US on encouraging semiconductor manufacturing, also strengthening supply chains. Lucilla, what are your thoughts on that kind of coordination between like-minded economies moving forward?
The coordination that is now taking place in the context of the Trade and Technology Council, for example, as I said earlier, refers a lot to our capability of understanding the value chain, maybe strengthening our capability of foresight, as Eva was saying earlier, and basically trying together to put in place a mechanism that allows us to anticipate any kind of disruptions that may take place. Obviously, both the European Union and the United States have some common issues and challenges, including the fact that when it comes to manufacturing, we both depend very much on other parts of the world. And so obviously, we both have the objective of strengthening our capabilities in the European Union and in the United States, respectively. And we both have a CHIPS Act, because the United States have a CHIPS Act. It's still in Congress, I understand, but there is a CHIPS Act in the States. We have different approaches, of course, in terms of policies, because you may know that in the European Union, we have state aid control. So to be able to preserve the single market in the European Union, we make sure that public support, which Christine explained very well why public support is needed in the case of semiconductors, Well, we have to make sure that this public support does not distort competition to any significant, in any significant way, and that these negative distortions are basically compensated by a positive impact on our economy. So we will be looking very much at the impact that investment can make on the whole European Union economy. And I think that the United States probably have a little bit of a different approach, simply because they don't have this policy of stated control. And so together we will also have to see, for example, how we can avoid that subsidy races take place. And this was very clearly expressed also in the statement that we published at the time of the Pittsburgh meeting, the first of the meeting of the Trade and Technology Council. So these are the areas where we are working on. Of course, the Trade and Technology Council will go on for a couple of years, so we will identify new areas. But obviously the two economies are very open to each other, and so there is a lot of cross-fertilization between the two areas. I think that it will be important then also to talk in similar ways to other like-minded partners, like, for example, Japan, because the value chain is global, and so we need to be able to reach out also to other parts of the world. When we designed and we proposed in the CHIPS Act the idea of identifying, anticipating disruptions and so on, we have identified a stage where actually before we trigger any crisis, we would discuss with our international collaborators. And so this is something and the mechanism that we will have to put in place in the context of the Trade and Technology Council, for example. And that would make sense, of course, to take place also not only with the United States, but also with other countries. So international collaboration, very important, but strengthening the ecosystem of semiconductors in the European Union, very important, with a very positive impact on the economy of the European Union. And here, if I can just link to a comment that I see in the chat about the focus, the lacking focus on packaging facilities, really makes me think just to highlight the fact that, of course, the European Commission will be looking favorably to all those efforts that have a positive impact on the economy of the European Union, whether because they also maybe include back-end facilities, or because companies serve not only themselves but also other designers of and are able to produce for other designers of the European Union. So these are all elements that are present in the regulatory framework of the CHIPS Act, and it's very important that they're taken into account.
And we look forward to continuing the discussion at the Trade and Technology Council's next gathering in France in the middle of May. We're looking forward to that very much. ITI will be participating as we did in the first meeting. So I appreciate that recognition of the importance of that venue. Wouter, you're going to get the last word because we're almost out of time, but I did want to pick up on the last little piece that Lucilla mentioned, because the reminder that the semiconductor investment that we're talking about is an ecosystem. It's obviously crucially dependent on manufacturing, such as Intel does, but also packaging and other elements, including what ASML does. So in the 45 seconds we have left or so, last word to you about your optimism for the CHIPS Act covering what we need to cover to improve the entire ecosystem's resiliency in the EU.
Yeah, so I appreciate everything that has been said, and I think we've talked a lot about production. We've talked a bit about packaging and testing, but there's a whole range of activities. I mean, we have to remind ourselves that ASML is just one of 6 very crucial steps in the production process. And we have many sort of industry peers such as Applied Materials and Tokyo Electron that are doing phenomenal work. They might not be based here, but they have activities here and customers here. And in a similar token, we've seen with the discussions around ARM that, there's a huge appreciation for, chip design capabilities here. Not often is mentioned that, we have Siemens with Mentor Graphics, also a great European player that carries global relevance, but they also need investment and need attention from policymakers. So we hope that there's going to be a nice horizontal view of all the different parts of the value chain in the upcoming legislative review. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Terrific thoughts, and thanks for mentioning Siemens, another great ITI member company as well that's doing important work here. I do wish we had more time together, but I want to thank our panelists for joining us on this critical conversation today. Greatly appreciate you all taking the time to join us and share your thoughts, and look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you to all in our audience who joined us for this event. So many terrific participants from across the Atlantic. The discussion again shows how important it is that industry and policymakers come together. ITI has the convening power to do it, and we will do it again to discuss the issue of resiliency in the semiconductor supply chains. Look forward to continuing to serve as a resource to policymakers and industry alike in this fundamental question of how we can improve the resilience in the semiconductor supply chain. And we look forward to continuing this discussion going forward from ITI's office in Brussels and our office in DC and our other offices around the world to continue the dialogue. Please visit us at itic.org for more information and to learn more. On behalf of the entire ITI team and our member companies, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for the excellent moderation, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great weekend to all.